Hey everybody, today we're going to talk about Steve Jobs' second rule. So we're starting out by setting up your notebook. This is your language arts journal, and in your table of contents you're going to add Steve Jobs rule number 2 to page 11. Remember, you can pause this video at any time and then start it again when you're ready to get caught up. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and turn to page 11 in my journal. And I'm going to add the title to that page, Steve Jobs rule number 2. Make sure you put today's date at the top. All right, I'm going to go back to my text of Steve Jobs' speech. I'm going to close read it. We've already read it one time through. So this time we are rereading for a purpose. We're going to be annotating and taking some notes in your notebook. All right, so it starts out on the third page of the speech, a little more than halfway down. My second story is about love and loss. I'm going to go ahead and write rule number 2 in the margin. Okay, and we're going to go back and reread this portion of the text a little bit. I was lucky. I found what I loved to do early in life. Waz and I started Apple in my parents' garage when I was 20. We worked hard, and in 10 years, Apple had grown from just the two of us in a garage into a $2 billion company with over 4,000 employees. We had just released our finest creation, the Macintosh, a year earlier, and I had just turned 30. And then I got fired. How can you get fired from a company you started? Well, as Apple grew, we hired someone who I thought was very talented to run the company with me, and for the first year or so, things went well. But then our visions of the future began to diverge, and eventually we had a falling out. When we did, our board of directors sided with him. So at 30, I was out, and very publicly out. What had been the focus of my entire adult life was gone, and it was devastating. Okay, so I'm going to stop right there. I'm going to go to my notes, and I'm going to make kind of a flow map of what Steve Jobs is talking about, because I know that in this part, he's talking about some events that happened that led up to him deciding to go start up his new company and then get back to Apple. So in my journal, I'm just going to make a little flow map here, starting with the first thing that happened. So I found what I love to do early in life. Waz and I started Apple in my parents' garage when I was 20. I'm going to underline that. And I'm going to make that my first entry here. Started Apple at age 20. I'm going to put a box around it. Remember to write your information first, do the box second. That way you don't run out of room, and that way your box isn't huge with tiny little writing in it. Doing that first. Okay, so started Apple at age 20. We worked hard, and in 10 years, Apple had grown from just the two of us in a garage into a $2 billion company with over 4,000 employees. So we're going to add that to our flow map next. Let's underline what we need to add. In 10 years, Apple had grown from just the two of us into a $2 billion company with over 4,000 employees. Okay, so I'm going to draw an arrow, and then I'm going to add a little note here, 10 years later, and we're going to say what Apple had become. It had grown into $2 billion company with over 4,000 employees. Okay, we're talking about Apple, the company. Okay, box it. Go back to the text. Don't forget, you can pause it anytime if I'm going too fast. Pause the video, press play when you're ready to go on. Back to the text. We had just released our finest creation, the Macintosh, a year earlier, and I had just turned 30. And then I got fired. So after that, fired, womp womp. That's a big event. So I'm going to put a starred little bubble around it. He got fired. How can you get fired from a company you started? Well, as Apple grew, we hired someone who I thought was very talented to run the company with me. And for the first year or so, things went well. But then our visions of the future began to diverge. And if you're not sure of diverge, there's your definition. And eventually we had a falling out. When we did, our board of directors sided with him. So at 30, I was out and very publicly out. What had been the focus of my entire adult life was gone, and it was devastating. We're going to add that information to our flow map here. So what led from this to this? Well, we're going to add a little information down here. So Steve Jobs says, how do you get fired from a company? Well, as Apple grew, we hired someone who I thought was very talented to run the company with me. So we're going to add a little arrow down here as Apple grew. What did they do? They hired someone to run the company who Steve Jobs thought he'd get along with. Hired someone to run the company with him. Okay. I'm going to put a circle around that because it's different than our main events of his life. This is kind of just like a side story. For the first year or so, things went well, but then our visions of the future began to diverge, and eventually we had a falling out. Okay, so then next, their visions diverged. I'm kind of circling my writing back toward fired because that's the direction we're going in. Their visions diverged. We had a falling out, which means, they had a disagreement. When we did, our board of directors sided with him. Okay, so visions diverged. So they had a falling out. I'm writing super small right here to make sure this all fits. Really tiny new bubble. Let me zoom in so you can see that. Falling out. Board sided with other guy. We don't know who he is. We'll just say other guy. The board of directors. The board of directors is kind of like a panel of people who makes decisions for a company. Right here, board of directors. Board of directors. They're the people who kind of help make the decisions. Like we have a school board. That's a similar concept. It's a panel of people who are the real decision makers, and then the superintendent or the president of the company, they have to talk with the board of directors just to make sure that they're doing the things that they want the company to do, following their vision, all that. So that's what the board of directors does. And so it sounds like Steve Jobs hired this guy to help him run the company, and things were going great. But then Steve Jobs had one idea for how he wanted the company ran. The other guy had another, so they had a disagreement about it. And so they went to their board of directors and said, here's the situation. And the board sided with the other guy, and Steve Jobs got fired. So that's how that ended up happening. So we showed that in our flow map. Okay, let's go back to the text now. Zoom back out. I really didn't know what to do for a few months. I felt that I had let the previous generation of entrepreneurs down, that I had dropped the baton as it was being passed to me. I met with David Packard and Bob Noyce and tried to apologize for screwing up so badly. I was a very public failure, and I even thought about running away from the valley. But something slowly began to dawn on me. I still loved what I did. The turn of events at Apple had not changed that one bit. I'd been rejected, but I was still in love, and so I decided to start over. So if I had to summarize this paragraph a little bit, I would say this is kind of about what happened after he got fired. In the beginning, after he first got fired, the first few months, said he didn't know what to do, sounded like, he was disappointed. He felt like he had let previous generation of entrepreneurs down. He let him down. He dropped the baton. He tried to apologize. He was kind of depressed. He was disappointed in himself, not really feeling too good. But then something slowly began to dawn on me. I still loved what I did. The things that happened at Apple didn't change that he still loved what he did, and so he decided to start over. So back to our flow map now, we're going to add that information. I'm going to move my flow map down to a new line like this. So this is kind of like the first few months after getting fired. The first few months. He was feeling really down. He was feeling disappointed. He tried to apologize. What else did he say? We said that felt like he let people down. Anything else you want to add there in your own words is also fine. Just kind of that he was really disappointed in himself is kind of the gist of it. So he was kind of moping around in this sad little rain cloud for a while. But then what happened? But something slowly began to dawn on me. I still loved what I did. So then he realized something. I still loved what I did. So that was a quote he said. So this is kind of a turning point for him that kind of broke him out of that funk. I still loved what I did, so I decided to start over. Decided to start over. Okay, back to the text. I didn't see it then, but it turned out that getting fired from Apple was the best thing that could have ever happened to me. The heaviness of being successful was replaced by the lightness of being a beginner again, less sure about everything. It freed me to enter one of the most creative periods of my life. Okay, so let's talk about that for a second. He says, I didn't see it then, but it turned out getting fired from Apple was the best thing that could have ever happened to me. The heaviness of being successful was replaced by the lightness of being a beginner again, less sure about everything. So, what he's talking about here, you know how when you're really good at something, there's kind of this pressure that you have either put on by yourself or by other people to always be really, really good at it. Like, if you are an all-star baseball player, you kind of feel this pressure to always be an amazing baseball player. So he's kind of comparing it to that the heaviness of being successful is replaced by the lightness of being a beginner again. Because when you're a beginner at something, people aren't expecting you to be amazing at it. You're probably not even expecting yourself to be amazing at it. Whereas if you're being successful, it comes with certain expectations. So that's kind of what he's talking about here. Getting fired from Apple ended up being a pretty good thing because he didn't have that pressure to be super successful like he did when he was working at Apple. So we're going to add that to our flow map next here. So he decided to start over. Let's see, how are we going to add that here? I'm kind of running out of room. How are you doing? Maybe I'll add a little tiny box here. And I'm going to add how he discovered the heaviness of success was replaced by lightness of beginner. All right, so we'll add that there. I'm gonna move my flow map up a little bit. Kind of run out of room, but I think we're nearing the end anyway. Okay. So he decided to start over. He discovered the heaviness of success was replaced by the lightness of being a beginner. And he is saying now it freed me to enter one of the most creative periods of my life. During the next 5 years, I started a company named Next. Okay, so underline that. Another company named Pixar. Hey, we know that. And fell in love with an amazing woman who would become my wife. So he fell in love. Pixar went on to create the world's first computer animated movie, Toy Story. Is now the most successful animation studio in the world. In a remarkable turn of events, Apple bought Next. I returned to Apple, and the technology we developed at Next is at the heart of Apple's current renaissance. And Lorene and I have a wonderful family together. So, here he's talking about what happened during the next 5 years after he kind of got through this depression of getting fired from Apple. So, we're going to add that. So, during the next 5 years, some remarkable things started to happen. So, first of all, he started a company named Next. Started Next. Okay. And then he started another company named Pixar. Okay, add that. And he fell in love and got married. Fell in love. Add a little heart. Okay. Back to the text. Then he goes on to describe how those successes ended up becoming even more successful than anything he ever did at Apple. He gives some details about Pixar. Pixar went on to create the world's first computer animated film, Toy Story, and is now the most successful animation studio in the world. So that's information about how Pixar went on to be amazing. So we need to add that. Toy Story and most successful animation studio in the world. Most successful animation studio in the world. So information about his success at Pixar. In a remarkable turn of events, Apple bought Next. I returned to Apple, and the technology developed at Next is at the heart of Apple's current renaissance. So large companies buy smaller companies all the time, and they kind of combine forces. So that's what he's describing here. So his company Next got bought by Apple. He says that's kind of a remarkable thing, kind of like a funny coincidence how that happened since he got fired by Apple in the first place. And the company he started ended up getting bought by Apple again anyway. So he technically went back to work for Apple, and the technology that was developed at Next is at the heart of Apple's current renaissance. And the renaissance meaning like a revival. When he gave this speech, Apple was like right about to release the first iPhone and iPads. It was a time when they were really becoming a big business again. And a lot of the technology they used came from this company he had started, Next, after getting fired. Bought by Apple. So we're going to say the Next technology was used by Apple. Just kind of adding it onto the other bubble. And he fell in love, and he and his wife have a wonderful family together. So this part of his speech is kind of telling us that things were actually not that bad. After where he got fired with this company he started at the age of 20 that grew into this huge successful thing, and he thought, that's it for me. What a failure I am. All these negative feelings of disappointment. But then he had this moment of realization, I still love what I do. And so he decided to start over and actually became more successful in starting over than he had been at Apple in the first place, with all these wonderful things happening to him. And then, funny enough, ended up being back at Apple anyway. So let's see how he concludes it out. I'm pretty sure none of this would have happened if I hadn't been fired from Apple. I'm going to underline that. It was awful tasting medicine, but I guess the patient needed it. Sometimes life hits you in the head with a brick. Don't lose faith. I'm convinced the only thing that kept me going was that I loved what I did. You've got to find what you love. And that is as true for your work as it is for your lovers. Your work is going to fill a large part, and the only way to be truly satisfied is to do what you believe is great work. And the only way to do great work is to love what you do. If you haven't found it yet, keep looking. Don't settle. And with all matters of the heart, you'll know when you find it. And like any great relationship, it just gets better and better as the years roll on. So keep looking until you find it. Don't settle. So this is kind of the advice portion of his speech. So underneath your flowchart, let's move that up a little bit. We're going to add some notes down here at the bottom of his kind of words of wisdom. First of all, he says, I'm pretty sure none of this would have happened if I hadn't been fired from Apple. So we're going to add that last little bit here to our flowchart. None of this would have happened if he didn't get fired from Apple. Okay. So now we're going to move down. If you are running out of room, you're going to have to start writing super small, or you can get another piece of paper, tape it to the bottom, and then fold it up. But hopefully you have enough lines like me that we can add a few notes down here about his advice at the end of his speech. So I'm pretty sure none of this would have happened if I hadn't been fired from Apple. It was awful tasting medicine, but I guess the patient needed it. So that's a figure of speech he's using right there. When he says it's awful tasting medicine, what do you think he means by that? I think he's saying, oh, it was like a hard lesson to learn, but I guess the patient needed it. I needed it anyway. Kind of like, when medicine tastes awful, but you need it because it makes you feel better. It's kind of what he's saying. It was a hard lesson of getting fired from Apple, but I needed it. Sometimes life hits you in the head with a brick. That's also a figure of speech. Life doesn't literally throw a brick at your head, but he's talking about sometimes hard things happen in life. Don't lose faith. I'm convinced the only thing that kept me going was that I loved what I did. You've got to find what you love. And that is as true for your work as it is for your lovers. So we're going to add that note down here and a little bullet point. You've got to find what you love. He says that's as true for your work as it is for the person you marry. Your work is going to fill a large part of your life, and the only way to be truly satisfied is to do what you believe is great work. And the only way to do great work is to love what you do. So the only way to be truly satisfied, blah, blah, blah. Oopsie. And if you haven't found it yet, keep looking. That's okay. So he's kind of saying that work is a big part of life, which means what does he say? The only way to be truly satisfied is to do what you believe is great work. Okay. Do what you believe is great work. That's to be satisfied. Do what you believe is great work. And the only way to do great work is to love what you do. It's all related. If you haven't found it yet, keep looking. Don't settle. As with all matters of the heart, you'll know when you find it. So over here, I'm going to write, don't settle was another big message of his. So I'll move that over. Don't settle. Keep looking if you haven't found it yet. As with all matters of the heart, so anything that means a lot to you, matters of the heart, things that are important, you'll know when you find it. You'll know when you find it. And like any great relationship, it just gets better and better as the years roll on. So keep looking until you find it. Don't settle. There's don't settle again. So I'm going to bold that. It's kind of his message there. Don't settle. Find what you love. Don't settle. Keep looking if you haven't found it. You'll know when you find it. And then he says, it just gets better as the years roll on. Okay. So that's the end of Steve Jobs' rule number 2. I just realized that we did not put the title of his rule number 2. It had to do with love and loss. Back here on the third page, love and loss. So go ahead and add that up here, love and loss. Okay? So what you should do for homework tonight is look back through your flow map, your story, and see if you can retell Steve Jobs' life based on this flow map that you've drawn. You can definitely go back to this speech if you need to. You should have annotated with me as we went. If not, you have to rewatch the video and find those annotations and see if you can find the connection between what happened in his life with getting fired from Apple, starting these companies. How does it relate to his message of don't settle, find what you love, keep looking? All right, great job, you guys. Thanks for checking out my video. See you soon.